What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video. This time we're going to be going over the Dragonknight tank. Uh, Unlike our other build videos, this particular build video is going to be divided up into several parts here. First part here is going to be this first video here. It's going to be basically going to be going over our gear sets. Tanking, unlike DPSing, or much like DPSing I should say, you do have the choice of gear sets depending on the situation you're in. So much like how Maxworks have the option between Negropotents and Julianos depending on whether they're using a pet or not, tanks also have various options of sets they can choose from depending on the situation and depending on the content they want to clear. So we're going to be going over the various gear combinations that you can use in this video today. So we're going to start off here with the gear that I currently have on my tank. For our monster's helm, we're going to be using Lord Warden Dusk. Both pieces are in Divines. I have one light and one medium, both with health enchants. Now you can use different traits depending on the RNG luck, how well your RNG is, depend when you do vet ICP or when you decide to go for the chest, the shoulder piece. For your shoulder piece, the other trait that you can use is Sturdy. You can use a Sturdy shoulder here to help decrease your block chance. And for your helm, you can also go with Infused. If you go with an Infused, you're going to want to use a Prismatic enchant instead of a health enchant. That's just so you can have some extra resources. It's not absolutely necessary. You can stick with health if you feel like you are dying too often. And I do recommend you put on a health until you are more comfortable with tanking content, just so you have that little extra buffer room to play around with. Now for our tanking gear, you want to have two 5-piece sets as a tank. And so this is how you kind of want to divide up your tanking gear. One set is always going to be what we call the health set. This gives you extra health or your group extra health. Just improve your survivability. And the second set that you want to pick out is going to be your utility or debuff set. And the point of that set is to either provide debuffs on the boss or enemies for your DPS so they can do higher DPS, or to give yourself or the group higher utility such as higher Warhorn uptime or bigger shields or something like that. So for this particular setup, this is the setup that I use to run all of the content, basically vet trials, vet DLC dungeons. This is the gear that I tend to stick to. You have Ebon Armory. This can be found used through Crypt of Hearts 1 or 2. You can have, I do recommend you farm both the armor pieces and the jewelry, so you have some flexibility as well. The weapons and shield I do not recommend farming right now because there is a bug where if you have ebon weapons on both bars and you swap, your health does go down by the about 1100 health that the 5-piece gives you. Which doesn't really make that big of a deal, but it can make or break you in some scenarios, so you do just want to avoid that. So definitely go for the armor and jewelry, but avoid the weapons and the shields for now until they fix that bug. For your armor, if you decide to go with all armor like I am here, your chest and leg are both going to be infused with prismatic enchants, and your small pieces, which are your hands, your waist, and your feet, are going to be in sturdy with health enchants. For our utility debuff set for this particular build, we're going to go with Alkosh. Alkosh can be found through Maw of Lorcage. You're going to definitely want to have jewelry pieces and then one hand and shield for Alkosh. This is because Alkosh was designed as a DPS set, so it is in medium armor. As you can see here, Belt of Alkosh right there is in medium. So obviously we don't want that to be necessarily in 5 armor pieces, so we're going to be sticking with jewelry and then sword and board. So for our jewelry pieces, they all have shield play, which reduces the cost of bash, but more importantly, reduces the cost of blocking by a fixed amount. And then for our weapons, they're both going to be infused. Our front bar is going to have Crusher, and our back bar is going to have Weakening, and that should always be the case no matter what your utility or health sets are. You always want to have Crusher, and you always want to have Weakening as your 2 enchants. Preferably your Crusher is going to be on your front bar because you stick with the front bar the most often. But depending on the content you're running, whether you're kind of solo, self-sustaining, kind of taking ads out from the boss like in Ozara, on Sanctum Ophidia, You can put the weakening enchant on the front bar too. For your shields, again, always going to want to have prismatic enchants for the extra resources, but you're going to want Nirnhoned. Now in this case, we have Nirnhoned Alkosh shields. You need to transmute your shields in order to get Nirnhoned, as well as know the Nirnhoned research trait on shields. So you will need not 50, 100 transmutation crystals in order to transmute 2 shields of Alkosh to Nirnhoned. But Nirnhoned is the preferred trait. You can also go with Infused, Reinforced, or Divines. If you're going for Infused, though, ideally you have both shields and Infused, so you don't have this weird offset in resources, but that's not that big of a deal if you don't. You can have your front bar be the Infused and the back bar be the Reinforced. It all depends on what you want to run. Now this is the kind of the go-to for endgame tanks, Eben and Alkosh. Eben obviously gives your group extra health, 1,118 extra health, which is quite sizable. It's a pretty good buff to your health. This is affected by passive, so it really ends up being more of a 1.4 to 1.5k health buff, which is definitely not something to be ignored in terms of utility. And then for Alkosh, why we're using Alkosh is for that 5-piece effect. When you activate a synergy, you send out a shockwave from your position that deals X amount of physical damage and additional X amount of physical damage over 10 seconds. It also reduces the physical and spell resistance of any enemy hit by X amount for 10 seconds. In this case, it's 2940 because we have purple rings, but with full gold, it's going to be 3010. That's why we're using Alkosh. As a tank, you're being fed synergies all the time, through shards, through orbs. Magsorks are going to be dropping the liquid lightning on top of the boss, which you're going to be standing right next to, so you can activate the synergy on that conduit. So you have access to a bunch of synergies as a tank, so that makes Alkosh very powerful because you can reduce the resistances of the boss by a huge amount. And in Trash Pulls, this becomes even more apparent because every enemy hit by that shockwave gets their resistances reduced by that amount. So that's why Alkosh is very, very strong. Now there is one downside of Alkosh, and that is the fact that you need to activate a synergy. Now that orbs and shards share synergies, Alkosh uptime is kind of decreased as a whole, at least in not very well coordinated groups. With very coordinated groups with 2 tanks both running Alkosh, you can see 100% uptime, but that's not really the norm for most progression groups. Most trial groups generally won't see 100% uptime on Alkosh, so that is something to keep in mind. That is a weakness of the set. So look at your uptimes for Alkosh. Ideally, theoretically, you can hit a 50% uptime if you are hitting your shards and orbs on cooldown. If you have a Magsork in the group, that's an extra synergy, so you could theoretically get 100% uptime if you can space out your synergies correctly. And with 2 tanks, getting 100% uptime is very possible to do if they aren't if they are managing to coordinate their synergies very well. However, if you're only 1 tank solo tanking it, it's more likely going to hit anywhere between 30 to 50% uptime on your Alkosh with a Magsork in group. So that is something to keep in mind with Alkosh. You're never really going to have an effective 30-10 debuff with all gold Alkosh. It's more likely going to be somewhere around 1500 to 1200 effective debuff. But when a debuff is active, it is a very sizable debuff. So do keep that in mind. Alkosh uptime is something to be aware of if you're going to use this set. Now you do have other options for sets. For health sets, you have Plague Doctor. Let me see if I can find a piece here. So that's Plague Doctor right there. This is a purple set, purple piece, not completely upgraded. But you can see here, the 5-piece adds a very large amount of health. The gold, when it's completely golded out, adds 4,000 extra health. So this is very selfish. It's a very selfish tanking set because it just increases your health and not that of the group. Now there are people who argue that because Dragonknight tanks have an ability, Igneous Shields, that gives 5 allies, I should say, a shield based on the amount of health that the tank has, that the 5-piece bonus from Plague Doctor, when you take into consideration that shield, is basically the equivalent of Eben Armory and the health that it gives. That is a complete and utter fallacy, and I can show you exactly why. Now if we go over to Igneous Shields right here, see here, have our shields. 44. Our shields here is 4,464 damage shield. Your own shield absorbs 200% extra damage, which is great and all. But what we're really looking at is the 4,464 damage shield to your allies. Now, we are on the PTS, so I am going to go ahead and gold out the Plague Doctor set, and I'm also going to take out the rest of Plague Doctor. And I will have to transmute these pieces so that the large pieces are infused. I don't believe I would need to enchant or transmute the small pieces to make them sturdy. That doesn't affect the health enchant on them. But I will have to change the large pieces to infused and make prismatic glyphs so we can have a fair one-to-one comparison compared to Ebon Armory. Go over here to our transmute station. Alright, so they're both infused. We just gotta make two prismatic glyphs here. There we go. And go ahead and enchant those. Alright, so... Oh. Don't want to do that. Alright, so now we're using Plague Doctors. Infused prismatic glyphs. We have divines on our small pieces, but that's not a big deal because that doesn't affect the health enchant that we have. So now we're going to go ahead and look at our shield. 4,960 damage. That is a difference of about 500 in terms of your damage shield if you switch between Ebon and Plague Doctor. That is compared to... Now if we swap back to our Ebon, Ebon gives 1,118 extra health. So that is a difference of about 600 or so effective health. If we think of shield as health, then we add Plague Doctor compared to Ebon, we get 500 extra shield at the expense of 1,100 health. That is a net loss of 600. So the people out there who are saying, oh, just wear Plague Doctors, the shields that you give your allies more than make up for the health that you lose with Ebon, that's completely wrong. You're off by 600 health. That is without the added passive, so it's really around 800, more or less, 700 to 800. Sure, you can argue that Bastion increases the shield that you give your allies, but that's not going to really make or break too much. So, to me, the whole argument that Plague Doctor is just as good as Ebon is not, at least in terms of group utility, it just doesn't hold. It doesn't hold any water. If you're going for group utility, stick with Ebon. But if you want to be more selfish, you can go with Plague Doctor, because you do get a significantly larger shield. You get, I believe, it's 2,000 extra shields that way. So it's really helpful for your self-sustain, it's really helpful for staying alive, and I do recommend you get it if you are a beginning tank. The other advantage of Plague Doctor is that it is a overland set, so you can purchase it off guild traders. So you don't have to farm for the pieces by doing dungeons over and over again, compared to Ebon. So that is an advantage of Plague Doctor. It's just more easily accessible, and it does give beginner tanks a little bit more health to play around with and to kind of give them a little bit of buffer on the harder fights. But that's really it for in terms of health sets. There is a set, Green Pact, but that relies on a food buff, and I don't really like the idea of relying on a food buff for my health. But Green Pact is a viable option. Let me see if I can find it here in the Overland set. Yep, here it is. You can see here it gives you basically more or less the exact same bonuses on the 3 to 4 piece. You get health recovery instead of healing taken, which is it depends. It's pretty much a wash in that case, but you can see there when you have food buff active, your health is increased by X amount and health regen by X amount. So it basically is a weaker form of Plague Doctor. So that's kind of why I avoid it. It's not as good as Plague Doctor, You do need to have a food buff active, so if you have to choose between Green Pact and Plague, go with Plague Doctor. But if you want to just go for maximum health, then you can pair Plague Doctor with Green Pact to maximize the amount of health that you can get. That is a completely viable option because they are overland sets, so they do drop in jewelry. Now for your utility, group utility, and debuff sets, you have a couple of options besides Alkosh. The first option that you can go to is Torug's Pact, which is a crafted set. It requires 3 traits for you to craft it. So as a crafted set, it comes with the advantage of you can make Nirnhoned shields right off the bat. You can create light and medium pieces, so you can do several combinations because the belt has the least amount of armor resist. Bracers is next, and then helm, shoulders, legs, and feet after that, and then chest have obviously the highest amount of resist with shields kind of falling kind of somewhere in the middle. So what you can do is you can have a light Sash of Torug's Pact with a, let me see if I can find it, medium bracers of Torug's Pact. And you can have a heavy piece, and then you can do sword and shield. Like so. Now, the disadvantage of using Torug's Pact is that you can't craft jewelry of Torug's Pact. So if you want to continue to use Ebon, or if you want to continue to use Plague, you need to have jewelry. So you need to have jewelry here. I'm missing a piece. Yes, I am. There we go. So that's the disadvantage there. Now, gold ebon jewelry does exist. It can be found on the Golden Trader, but that's kind of a RNG-based chance. We don't really know what the Golden Trader in Cyrodiil will have at any given weekend. Ebon has been on there, but since it is a bind on pickup, once you buy it, you can't trade it. So if you want gold ebon jewelry, you basically have to save up the AP or the gold in order to buy the jewelry. So most of us will end up having purple ebon jewelry, which does decrease the 5-piece effect by about 200 health, which isn't that big of a deal, but it is more pieces that you have to farm for. But here's the why you can use Torug's Pact as a second group utility or debuff set as a tank. So we always want to go with Infused, and we always want to have Crusher on our front bar. So you can see here, Torug's 5-piece increases the potency of our enchant by an additional 30%. So normally an Infused Crusher is 2108. With Torug's Pact, you get 2740 instead as your enchant. And because it also decreases the cooldown on our weapon enchant, it basically guarantees that we'll have 100% uptime on that Torug's Crusher enchant, 2740. Now, back to the Alkosh idea. If you have the Infused Crusher, you have a 2108 debuff. Now, you also have the Crusher debuff, which, when it's active, is 3010. Now, again, we have that uptime kind of challenge with Alkosh. So, depending on the percentage uptime, you can multiply that by the percentage that you have up on Alkosh, and that gives you the effective amount of debuff. Alkosh will beat out Torug's Pact if you have 30% uptime or higher on Alkosh. So Torug's is great if you know you're going to have low Alkosh uptime, but otherwise Alkosh is going to beat out Torug's Pact in terms of the size of the debuff that you can get. Now, do keep in mind that Crusher does have a 5-second cooldown when it's infused, so even though theoretically you can get 100% uptime on the Crusher enchant with Alkosh, more likely you're going to have somewhere between 90 to 95%, which is where that 30% uptime from Alkosh comes from. So if we have 1000 from the Alkosh effective debuff from Alkosh, plus the about 2000 from the Crusher, that makes about 3000, which beats out Torug's Pact by about 250. But the advantage of having Torug's Pact is you know you'll always have that 2740 just because it's going to be up all the time. That's kind of the advantage of having Torug's Pact. But again, the downside is you can't have jewelry, so you need to farm for Ebon or Plague Doctor or Green Pact jewelry depending on what set you're going to be using. Now, a third potential set that you can use as utility set, if I can find it here, is Akaviri Dragon Guard. It has some very useful 2 to 4 piece bonuses actually. Magica Regen, Healing Taken, and Max Health. That's very, very useful as a tank. Magica Regen is very useful as a tank because a lot of your buffs come from Magica, and Magica does regen while you're blocking, so you're going to be using a lot of magic. So the higher you regen, the better. But the beauty is the 5 piece. It reduces the cost of your ultimates by 15%. That basically turns Warhorn into a 213 cost ultimate, and your Barrier and Magma Shell down to 170. However, this does not actually affect the amount of resources you get back from Battle Roar. You will gain, so let's say you're using Magma Shell, you're self-sustaining the Ozara adds in Sanctum Ophidia. You're using Dragon Guard, so you only have 170 ultimate to gain between each proc of Magma Shell, each activation of Magma Shell. When you activate it, you actually get back the amount of resources you would get as if you had to use 200 ultimate. So that's kind of where Dragon Guard comes into play. When you need to have some extra Warhorn uptime, because now you'll decrease the cost of your Warhorn by almost 40 ultimates, which is about 12-13 seconds, I believe. Plus you also have decreased cost of Magma Shell, so it's easier to pop your Magma Shell in those oh shit scenarios, in those cases where you need those resources back. You can pop your ultimates a lot quicker this way. So that's kind of where Battle Roar comes into play. Battle Roar and Dragon Guard. So for example, my personal when I have to do basically self-sustain without a healer, for example AA Axes or Ozara adds in Sanctum Ophidia, or even the second boss of Halls of Fabrication, when I have to do the adds, I'll go with Plague Doctor and Alchemy Dragon Guard, basically selfish sets, slot Magma Shell, and basically have enough resources to self-sustain my way through it. I self-sustain through about 6 minutes of the Ozara ad fights by myself with no healer, using that kind of setup, with Bloodspawn added in for some extra ultimate regen. So Dragon Guard is a very, very potent set to use, especially if you need to self-sustain. And now I did mention Bloodspawn as a Monster Helm set, so that is another set that you can use. See there, the one piece effect is basically wasted because you don't regen stamina when you're blocking, so the stamina regen pretty much goes to waste there. But the 2-piece effect, when you take damage, you have 60% chance to generate 14 ultimate and increase your resistances by 6,450 for 6 seconds. It is a low proc chance, but it does proc fairly often as a tank, just because you're taking so much damage a lot of the time. Every single tick of damage has a chance of proccing it, as long as it's not within that 6-second cooldown period. So Bloodspawn is particularly powerful. Now you do get lower resistances overall compared to Lord Wardens because of that 1-piece effect. When Lord Warden is procced, you do get a lot more resists out of, I think it's about a extra 400 resists out of Lord Warden compared to Bloodspawn, so that is something to keep in mind. But Bloodspawn, the ultimate gen, cannot be discounted. But Lord Warden has the added benefit of giving you extra resists, almost 4,000 resists to allies around you, which is also something that can't be discounted, especially for those stack and burn fights in certain trials. So that's basically it for gear for a tanking set. So that kind of concludes this first part of the tanking guide that I have out. I know this is kind of long, but it is necessary so you guys can get an idea of the versatility in terms of set decisions that you have as a tank. For our next part, we're going to be going over gear attributes, or not gear, we just went over gear, skills, attributes, and CP point distributions. That part's going to be coming up pretty soon here. It's going to be part 2. And then part 3 is basically going to be, I'm going to be showing you guys how to tank. I'll be going through one fight, probably a vet trial fight. I'll see if I can get one of my fights as a tank recorded, and I'll voice over that so you guys can get a sense of how tanking goes in ESO, because tanking in ESO is very different compared to other MMOs. So that's it for this video. Be on the lookout for part 2 of the tanking guide, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.